This is a story about a guy who finds himself in a rather unusual situation that he certainly didn't expect. This guy's name is Lee Oh-jin, and he was currently 31 years old. In fact, he was an ordinary lighthouse keeper on a desert island. He was an ordinary employee of the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and Fisheries. The work was rather quiet, because the island was uninhabited, so he spent most of his time at the computer, sitting on various forums. In fact, Lee Oh-jin got the job by going through a huge competition. As many as 50 people wanted to take the job. However, when the competition was over, a letter came to him saying that he was now a civil servant. Initially, it was a rotational job with shifts every other month. However, when the first month passed, not a single word was heard from his shift worker. Lee Oh-jin was very angry. He didn't understand where his replacement was, as the month was already coming to an end. That day, the guy didn't hit the table hard enough with his fist, so all the things he was wearing got all bumpy. Then, calming down a little, he went to the window and looked out. It was raining heavily outside, and because of that, the sea was raging with strong waves that were crashing against the rocks near the lighthouse. The boy wished the rain would stop soon. In fact, Lee Oh-jin wasn't doing as well as he expected. The problem wasn't just the changeling, but his supplies were about to run out soon. Actually, this lighthouse where the guy worked was located on a small island called Guldokdo. It was located 90 kilometers from the port of Incheon. The nearest inhabited island, called Baekjeongdo, takes an hour by boat, while Incheon is a full 3 hours away. And that's assuming it's going to be good weather. You can only sail in calm weather. You can never sail in a storm like this. Lee Oh-jin stared out the window for a while, and then returned to his computer. He wanted to turn it off, thinking it was time to rest. But then suddenly, something strange caught his attention. The computer displayed a notification that he had no internet connection. He thought it was probably because of the rain and the heavy storms. In fact, his internet had been down for several days. Lee Oh-jin panicked. After all, if his internet went down now, it would be a nightmare for him. Suddenly, the boy's stomach rumbled. He realized that he was hungry. He got up from the table and thought about the fact that his salary was very small and he had no internet. He didn't realize what he had to choose from. It's an extreme job, you might even say. Who knows what might happen in a big storm? So he opened the drawer and took out the small candy bar that was left. He opened his only food he could snack on in times like these. After that, he undid the top buttons of his shirt to relax a little. Lee Oh-jin tried to calm himself down. After all, he needed to maintain self-control at times like this. So he went to the refrigerator to get some beer. But as soon as he looked through the half-empty refrigerator, he didn't see a single can. The guy was very surprised. He didn't think the beer would run out so quickly. But then suddenly, he heard some strange noises. He was really curious about what it was, so he decided to go downstairs and check it out. That's when the unexpected happened for poor Lee Oh-jin at night, in the pouring rain on a small desert island. There was a loud knock on his iron doors. At that moment, the boy thought that in fact, it was the perfect scene to begin a scary story. Then the iron door opened with a creak. But it wasn't as scary as one might expect. The door opened, and an elderly man appeared. He was holding some kind of backpack. He took off his hood and said that there was a big storm outside. The stranger, seeing Lee Oh-jin in front of him, said hello and asked how he was doing. The boy was very surprised and asked if he had sailed yet. It had actually been a month since Lee Oh-jin had last seen him. It was Mr. Park. He was one of the 2 fishermen who had come for a long-term fishing trip. The man began to take off his wet raincoat and said, "How could he sail away? It's been raining hard for days, and the ship could capsize because of it. He doesn't want to take any chances." In fact, avid fishermen who are fully equipped come in season. They find a spot and fish there for several days at a time. And what is an extreme workplace for Lee Oh-jin? For them, it is a great place to go fishing to catch as much of their prey as possible. Mr. Pak wiped himself to avoid dripping on the floor and started to go upstairs. Then the guy asked what the occasion was for coming to him suddenly, and the guest replied that what he really wanted was to ask for hot water. They were thinking of boiling it on the burner. However, in such rain, this is a pointless activity. Then they began to climb to the top of the lighthouse. Leojin was glad that they were in a relatively safe place. In fact, some fishermen would get far out on the reef and they would end up being washed out to sea where they would drown, with no one to help them. Suddenly, Mr. Pak stopped. He turned to the boy and said, laughing, that he must think he was quite ill-mannered. Leojin was very surprised at this, as he was still immersed in his thoughts. But then he smiled and said that he didn't think so at all. But the man then opened his backpack and said that he had not come empty-handed. The man opened his backpack and said that he had not come empty-handed. He then slammed his box shut and proudly turned his nose up and said he was the one who caught it in the storm. Leojin was very surprised when he saw the fish. He asked if it was the sea bass. It was very big, and he had never seen one like it before. By then they had already entered the room, and Mr. Park said that he was grasping everything on the fly by the day, and even the size knows straight to the experts already. Then the guest put his box on the table and said he would leave them for him, and Leojin could make soup or sashimi. Leojin sighed heavily afterward and said that he didn't really have soy sauce, wasabi, or anything else needed for these dishes. Mr. Park sat down on the bed and said that actually, fresh sashimi tasted sweet as it was, but if he didn't want it that way, he could just make soup for himself. The guy got even sadder and said he didn't even have any soup seasoning, none at all. He didn't have anything at all, not even any beer left. Puck was indignant, but he didn't say anything. He thought that this guy didn't like everything. Leojin thought for a while and calmed down. After that, he said that he was grateful anyway. Then he took a thermos from the shelf and asked if he could pour hot water into it. The gentleman said that's exactly where he needed to go, and also asked that the guy give him more 3-in-1 coffee, 2 bags. Leojin was indignant and said that actually he had a little left over too. The man asked that he shouldn't be so petty and share because he didn't have much. When the guy went to pour hot water for him, the guest said that he had already gotten coffee for himself. At this point, Leojin was surprised. He didn't understand why he had to ask if he had already gotten the coffee. Mr. Pak, seeing the look on his face, became indignant and told him not to be so indignant, for next time he would buy him 100 such bags. Then the man started looking around the room, thinking about what else he needed. He saw a box of medicine under the bed and asked the guy if he would give him some more ointment and some plasters. Leojin was surprised and looked at his guest and asked if he had hurt himself. Mr. Park touched his cheek and said that he had hurt himself a little. He wanted to say something else about his friend but changed his mind. After that, he took his hand away from his face, and Leojin saw some strange scratches on his cheek, the likes of which he had never seen before. The boy looked at it more closely for a while, for the wound was indeed strange. But after that he went back to his thermos, thinking that there was probably nothing serious in there, for the man had reached the lighthouse on his own. After a while he escorted his guest back, gave him water and coffee. The man put his raincoat back on and went back to his room, thanking him for everything. When Leojin was alone, he went back to that fish and started looking at it carefully. He didn't know what to do with it, and he didn't want to eat sashimi. He looked at the fish for a while longer, and then suggested that he could cut off the head and boil his own ramen. The guy grabbed the tail of the fish and realized that first of all it should at least be cut up, and after that he would already figure out what to cook. But as soon as he picked up that fish, his hand immediately went down. The fish was very heavy, and he didn't understand why it was suddenly. With quite a bit of labor, he still transferred the huge fish to the board. It barely fit. Leojin picked up his knife and chopsticks. He wondered if she had something on the other side, so he started to turn her over. Soon he managed to turn the fish over, but then suddenly he saw something strange above the fin. It made him feel sick. When the shock passed, he began to scrutinize this unknown thing. It looked disgusting enough, like 2 small volcanoes. Leojin didn't understand what it was. He assumed it might be some kind of marine parasite. But it was strange enough. because usually parasites live on some rocks or coral. He considered which side to approach the fish from, but it didn't look appetizing at all. Then he decided to strip the fish after all and see what was inside it. Maybe things would be better. Well, after a while, he did it. And when he looked inside the fish, he saw something horrifying. All its organs were covered with these little parasites. The guy thought it was just disgusting. He assumed they were somehow trying to get out, as if they were alive. Then he took the fish organs and threw them in the sink. Then the horrible aroma of fish wafted to him, and it made him feel sick. He decided to open the window to get some air out of the room. And when he went to the window, he saw something strange. He couldn't believe it. He was very frightened. And then he immediately started to act. In fact, out the window he saw a huge ship coming through the waves straight toward his lighthouse. Leo Jean began to quickly climb the stairs even higher to prevent trouble. He couldn't believe that he hadn't noticed such a large ship approaching him before. And so, when he had already reached the very top, he looked out the window and was very surprised, because the huge ship that was speeding toward his lighthouse was no longer there. Leojen was very surprised and wondered if he had imagined it. He didn't understand how such a ship could disappear in such a short time. He decided to check the radar to see if there was anything there. When he went to the monitor, he saw that everything was absolutely clear. The guy realized that he had just made a mistake, because you can't trust your feelings in the open sea. He looked at the radar for a while to make sure, but there was nothing there even after a while. Leo Jean thought at this moment that he was no longer at the age to believe in ghost ships and Bermuda Triangles. He had only been scared for nothing. The guy realized that if there really was any such ship, the chief of the fishing division would be sure to let him know. Then suddenly he remembered that he still had to take the blanket off the generator, for it was probably all wet from the rain. He headed back to his quarters, thinking about his other chores. He still had to wipe down the railings, the toilet, clear out, and change the light bulbs. And now, quite some time later, thinking back to that moment, the guy always thought of two things: about what he had done wrong and what he had done right after all. After all this time, Lee Ojen realized that it was wrong not to find out more about the strange ship he had seen that day. And what he did right was that it was a good thing he didn't eat the fish that Mr. Pack gave him at the time. This strange fish with its peculiarities was left lying on his cutting board, because Lee Ojen had gotten distracted while doing his chores and had completely forgotten about it. In fact, the thunderstorm continued that day, and then, at the sound of thunder and lightning, a monster emerged from the sea, all covered in parasites. Blood was pouring out of his eye sockets, but this did not prevent him from smiling maliciously. That day, Lee Ojen, toward evening, had done all his chores and even changed the light bulb. He sat on his bed and covered himself with a blanket against the cold. Soon it was getting harder and harder for him to sit up, so he lay down on the bed, his eyes slowly closing, and the guy drifted off to sleep. Lee Ojen couldn't understand why his replacement still hadn't arrived. He was already tired of sitting in that lighthouse. He had very little supplies left, only 2 small bags. He thought about the fact that his replacement would have to come soon, or at least have some food delivered to him. He lay there for a while longer, and then realized that he was hungry again, so getting out of bed, he decided to make himself some noodles. Lee Ojen prostrated himself a bit because he had been lying down all this time, but then suddenly, as he approached the kitchen, a strange aroma reached him. As he got closer, he covered his nose because the smell was unbearable. In fact, it was the fish entrails he'd left in the sink. He decided to go closer to check why it smelled so bad. Some strange black smoke suddenly began to appear from behind the sink. Lee Ojen looked inside and was surprised because the whole shell was covered with these sea parasites. He went and got himself some rubber gloves. He didn't really want to do that, but he had no choice but to wonder if he could pry them off with a table knife. However, as he was about to put everything away, he suddenly heard someone banging hard on his door. Liujin was very surprised and slowly started to go downstairs to open the door. However, someone there impatiently continued to bang on it heavily. He didn't realize maybe something was wrong. He continued down the stairs to open the door. So after a while, Liujin finally reached down and opened his iron door, launching cold and wet air into the inside of the lighthouse. The boy looked at the man who stood there and wondered why he was knocking so loudly all of a sudden. The stranger's face was not visible. But then the stranger suddenly smiled. Liujin asked in surprise, "Is it really Mr. Park?" The stranger, however, answered nothing. Before long, he looked at the guy. Liujin, seeing his face, was horrified. Then the stranger suddenly began to walk inside. He growled and wheezed disgustedly. Liujin immediately began to step back. He asked the gentleman why he suddenly looked and spoke so strangely. However, the stranger didn't answer anything. He just reached out his hands to the guy. Then Liujin saw the very same sea parasites on his hand, just like on the fish and in his shell. He immediately covered his nose with his hand because it stunk horribly and said it was just disgusting. That monster suddenly looked with its horrible eyes, which were also all covered in parasites, and smiled viciously at Liujin. The boy began to climb the stairs carefully in order not to scare him away. In fact, he was trembling with fear. Liujin couldn't understand what was wrong with Master. It was as if he was infected with rabies. But at this second, the monster suddenly ran straight at the guy, screaming at the same time. Liujin immediately sped up and started climbing up the stairs. It really scared him. Liujin couldn't understand what was happening to him. He couldn't believe that he was really crazy. At this time, the monster wasted no time. Smiling, he continued to climb up after his prey. Liujin, turning around to see if the master was far away, continued running. He thought that he needed to get to a safe place first, and then thought about the rest. Soon he climbed high enough. Then he saw the doors, thinking to himself that he was almost there. He had only a little more to go and he would be safe. At that time, Liujin still ran into the room and quickly slammed the doors behind him so hard that the sound echoed throughout the lighthouse. The boy closed the door with his back, breathing heavily with fear. He heard the monster's footsteps, which stopped louder and louder. That meant he was getting closer. It scared him even more. He didn't understand what would happen next and how to defend himself in case of trouble. But at that moment, he suddenly heard silence. This alerted Liujin, so he decided to look out the door and see what was going on. Through a small slit, he saw a monster eating fish. It looked pretty good, but it smelled even worse. Liujin took a closer look and noticed that the monster was eating the innards that he had recently discarded. The monster was greedily eating the insides of the fish, which were also all covered in these marine parasites. Liujin didn't understand why the monster was suddenly eating them so greedily. He assumed that the monster might have reacted to the smell. The boy was not very pleased to see all this. Then he looked in the corner and saw a sack with a can on it. It was the body lotion that Liujin used when he couldn't shower. The boy realized it was just what he needed. He'd have to beat the smell and get out. Liujin walked over to the bag and took the lotion and began to smear it on his hands so that he wouldn't smell anymore. When the deed was done, he slowly opened the door and began to walk out while carefully watching the monster. Liujin was actually insanely scared. However, he held himself well and didn't make the slightest sound. The guy slowly moved forward towards his salvation. When he passed that room where the monster was, Liujin immediately started running without wasting a second of his time. It wasn't long before he descended completely out of the lighthouse and quickly opened his iron doors and ran outside, where it continued to rain heavily. But Liujin ran outside and started shouting, addressing Mr. Kim. He continued to do so for a while, but then suddenly stopped. The guy realized that he wasn't getting anywhere, and it was useless to do it, because the rain was too heavy and no one would hear him. Every second he spent outside got even wetter. Liujin really wished that the rain would stop after all. He would feel much better then. Then he suddenly looked around and saw a tent not far away from him. This pleased him very much. But when he came closer, he was horrified at what he saw. The entrance to the tent that was on the ship had been torn open, and he saw the marks of someone's blood on top of it. Lee Ojin couldn't believe it. It frightened him. However, then suddenly, the screams of monsters reached him from the lighthouse, and he realized that he had no choice. Soon the boy did get inside that tent. He began to look through the contents of the tent for anything he could use. Then, in one of the bags, he saw a table knife. Lee Ojin immediately picked it up, thinking that he could take it just in case. At this point, he searched some more and found a flashlight for himself, and something unknown to him with an iron cone on a pendant. He decided to take it too, since it could be used for self-defense in case of anything. Lee Ojin also put on his life jacket, but he still had one question. Where is Mr. Kim? He couldn't believe that he could have been killed already. But then suddenly, as he continued to look for new things for himself, he noticed a sealed bag that contained a phone and keys. Lee Ojin was very surprised, because usually the master never leaves this unattended. After all, the keys were from the ship. Lee Ojin looked at the lighthouse and thought that perhaps he should still take a ship to Pejeongdo right now and ask someone for help there. He took this bag of belongings and thought about how he didn't want to leave Mr. Pak in this place at all, because it could be dangerous. He looked around at the supplies for a while longer. After that, I thought happily that he had managed to get out of the lighthouse unnoticed by the monster after all. However, as time passed, the guy realized that that horrible sound was getting closer and closer to him. So he had to move. Lee Ojin needed to bring backup as soon as possible in order to save the Lord in case of anything. The boy ran up to the ship, and when he started it, he was very glad to see that the engine was working after all. He went straight to the wheel. Before long, Lee Ojin had already sailed as far away from the ship as possible towards the city with great speed for someone to help him. He was steering the wheel. His hands were no longer shaking, and he was not so cold. But he did not know what to do now. Lee Ojin didn't know how to explain the situation. If he said something about the monster, everyone would think he was crazy. The guy kept sailing, but the storm was still raging. The waves were getting bigger and stronger, and it was getting much harder for him to steer his ship. And at that moment, the wave suddenly gathered so high that it almost toppled his ship. Lee Ojin became more and more worried, but he kept his composure and continued sailing forward. Soon he began to sail toward the mountains, into which lightning was striking from time to time, for the storm continued. Lee Ojin looked at his phone, which had a notification from his wife saying that she was worried and asking if he would be back soon, and realized that this was not a good time to worry. He needed to call for help. The guy quickly opened his phone and started dialing. He had only 1% left, but the connection was good. Some children's song played on the other side of the phone, but the phone turned off at the same second because it had run out of power. Lee Ojin was very angry about this. He didn't want the phone to run out of power this minute. Suddenly, the guy heard that song playing on his phone again. It freaked him out. He didn't expect to hear any other ringtone on the ship. But then he suddenly realized that it was possible that Mr. Kim's phone could also be somewhere nearby. Lee Ojin left his helm and went to look for the phone he thought the tune was coming from. He was so engrossed, however, that he didn't notice someone else coming up from behind him. Straight out of the ocean, another monster began to climb up onto the ship, which was also covered in sea parasites. Lee Ojin, who was still looking for the phone, didn't understand how it could be. He could hear the song, but he couldn't find the device. This guy even made it kind of creepy to stand up, because the song was certainly childish. However, he had watched a lot of horror movies in which they kill after such a thing. But at that moment, the ship suddenly began to shake violently. Lee Ojin was very surprised. He didn't understand what was happening. When he looked to the side, he saw that a huge wave had begun to cover him. As one trouble passed, another began to approach. It was a monster, and it came up on the ship, and then the boy noticed it after all. After looking straight into his eyes, Lee Ojin was very frightened. He didn't expect to see him, so he immediately started trying to run away. It was the same Mr. Kim. However, he didn't look alive, but instead looked like a dead man walking around. The man approached Lee Ojin, and at that moment the phone rang in his pocket. a children's tune played again, and the screen showed an inscription saying that his wife was calling him. However, the phone soon went silent, and the continuation of the song was already being sung by the monster turned Mr. Kim. At this moment, they were suddenly hit by a wave again. Leojin was able to hold on and didn't fall, but the monster who had just climbed onto his ship slipped and fell to the floor. However, at that moment, the gentleman's head suddenly turned around and looked straight into the guy's eyes without averting his gaze. Leojin was very scared when he saw this. He covered his mouth with his hand to keep from screaming, and he even started to vomit. Soon, a strong wind blew, and the scent that came from this monster reached him. Then the guy couldn't take it anymore, and he threw up in the end. The monster heard these sounds and immediately went straight for the guy to kill him. Leojin was very frightened when he saw this. He pressed himself against the wall even harder, realizing that the monster was crawling towards him. However, at that moment, the guy remembered his findings, which he took from the tent, and immediately pulled out something like nunchucks. He was insanely scared and cold, and his whole body was shivering. However, as soon as the monster got close, the guy punched him in the face. The guy lost his coordination for a while. However, the creature stood still for a while. After that, it went on the offensive again. Leojin realized that he couldn't do anything, and the monster didn't care at all. The boy was very scared. He didn't know what to do, and the monster was getting closer. He looked around nervously for something to throw at it. Leojin was very scared. Even so, he started groping all the things behind him. He didn't know what to think of. Then he suddenly fumbled for a heavy ball which was tied with a rope. He was very happy and thought that this was his salvation. Then, without wasting time, he threw the ball in a somersault straight at the monster. This created a noose that was placed around the creature's head. Leojin, upon seeing this, became very excited. He realized that he had succeeded, and this was his chance. However, the monster didn't pay attention to the noose that had formed around his neck and continued walking towards the guy. And so, when the monster had already reached his hands to the guy, he suddenly stopped because the rope pulled him by the neck and did not let him pass. Leojin immediately got to his feet. This made him very happy, and he exhaled a sigh of relief as he thought about what he needed to pack. If the ship capsized, it would definitely be the end of him. But then, suddenly, he heard some kind of cracking noise. He looked at the rope that was wrapped around and restraining the monster. There he saw that the rope was already beginning to tear. He began to run quickly to the cabin while the rope was still intact. He had to make it. Leojin ran into the cabin fast enough. The rope was only a little bit left and it would release the monster. However, the guy was already at the helm and started steering the ship. He loosened it to the other side, thinking to himself that the monster would stop chasing him already. The waves continued to rage. They were already so high that the water was even hitting the ship itself. At that moment, Leojin thought that his end had come. The ship was wobbling so much that he could barely stay in his cabin. He looked at the monster that was restrained by the rope. The boy didn't understand how he was even enduring all this. He was very scared. He didn't know if he would live to see the end of this deadly ride, or what he would do when the rope broke and the monster came running at him. They kept going forward. Suddenly he saw a bright light nearby, and when they got closer he saw a lighthouse. Leojin was very happy, because it was the port he was on his way to. He realized that he only had to hold on a little longer, and everything would be fine. He would be rescued. At that moment the ship rocked once more. The rope could no longer hold, and then the boy heard a great cracking sound. The monster was finally on the loose and started running straight at the guy to kill him. Leojin looked at the lighthouse and wondered if he should jump right now after all, or if he should still stay on the ship and wait until he got closer. The monster was already right in front of the cabin. He realized that he couldn't wait any longer, so he adjusted his vest and jumped overboard. For some time he was underwater. When the air began to run out, the boy rose to the surface. He looked around and saw a lighthouse right in front of him. The lightning continued to strike and the rain continued to fall. Leojin swam towards the lighthouse again and thought he should swim to it. He didn't have much time left. But at that moment the waves suddenly raged, and one huge one rose up behind the lad. Leojin couldn't react in time, and there was nowhere to run to. The wave hit him head-on, so he found himself underwater, having gained some air before he did so. The guy was having a hard time getting his bearings. He began to toss from side to side, and he was going down. Lee Ojin didn't want this to happen. He started silently asking for help, though of course he didn't make a sound. At that moment, he began to choke. He wanted to take a breath of air, but he couldn't, and filled his lungs with nothing but water. Lee Ojin realized at this moment that this was his end, and as he had always heard, his life was passing right before his eyes. Suddenly, the guy saw his only family right in front of his eyes. It was his brother. In fact, Lee Ojin failed the civil servant exam 5 times, and his brother still continued to support and believe in him. All the same, he said, don't give up and keep fighting. Lee Ojin always had someone to come to for vacations. He wasn't alone, not for one holiday, no matter how hard his life was. But at this moment, when Lee Ojin was about to close his eyes and he was already short of breath, he suddenly heard a very familiar voice. It was his brother's voice shouting for him to wake up. The boy was very surprised to hear his brother's voice. However, he realized that it was a sign that he needed to keep fighting and get out. All the fog that had been in his head was gone in a flash. Lee Ojin tried to climb out, however. He couldn't do anything, just spinning around because the waves made him unable to handle his body. The guy realized that he couldn't die that easily. He had to at least try. He started to struggle, trying to get upstairs. Soon he caught the right wave and made it to the shore of the lighthouse after all. He succeeded. He didn't die. Lee Ojin walked a few meters and then fell onto the cold and wet tiles. He just lay there for a while, filling his lungs with air, happy that he had succeeded. And after that, he couldn't contain his emotions and cried with happiness, happy that he had managed to get there after all. He had survived. Then he wondered if what happened to Mr. Kim and Mr. Pak would be considered self-defense. However, he pushed those thoughts away and realized that it was more important that Pak-san was still on Kuldokdo. He would be the proof. Lee Ojin started to get very cowardly because of the cold. However, he realized that as soon as morning came, he would immediately go to the police. For now, he needed somewhere to take shelter from the rain. He started looking around at the closed buildings. Because of the heavy rain, everything was closed. The guy thought that, of course, he could go to the head of the unit, so that's what he decided to do. However, when he approached the building and pulled on the doorknob, nothing happened. He thought, is the door locked from the inside? He had no way of knowing what had happened and why the doors were locked, much less from the inside. It was a mystery to him. In fact, on the other side of the door, Lee Ojin didn't see that it was covered in blood. The doors were covered in handprints. He suddenly felt sick with all these thoughts. He couldn't understand what had happened and why no one was there. Suddenly, he felt dizzy. He leaned his arm against the wall to keep from falling. The boy tried to come to his senses. Lee Ojin couldn't take it anymore. He had to at least get some rest. All his strength was running out. At that moment, he remembered that there must be a spare key somewhere near the main entrance. That thought made him happy. Soon he began his search for the key and then crawled under one of the drawers and fumbled for it after all. Lee Ojin was very happy when he took out the key. After all, it was his salvation. He was also comforted by the fact that he knew how to use it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to open the door. In fact, if the guy didn't drink often with his boss, he wouldn't even know the location. That would be very bad for him. At that moment, he went to the door and started to open it. Mentally, Lee Ojin began to apologize to his superior. In fact, he wasn't even going to litter there. He would be reimbursed later. Before long, he did go into the room. It was quite dirty, not as dirty as usual. There were various papers on the floor that had been flooded with water. Lee Ojin didn't understand what was going on. However, he decided that it would be better not to stop and walked on, looking around. When he entered one of the corridors, he was very surprised because a distinct odor reached him. The guy didn't understand where the stench was coming from, but he decided not to stop and walked on. Then suddenly, he stepped on something, and when he looked down, he saw some bugs, quite a lot of them. The boy was very frightened when he saw them. He didn't understand where they came from. Liujin then decided to retreat back a bit so they wouldn't attack him, and when he did, he crushed one of the bugs again. The guy began to scrutinize its body, and when he saw that liquid was pouring out of it, he realized that this bug was called a sea midge. However, this surprised him greatly, for he did not know that such mochi lived on the seashore. Liujin didn't understand how it found itself in such a place. He didn't dwell on it much longer, though. The guy went on, thinking about how it made absolutely no sense at the moment. Liujin realized that it didn't matter at all right now, because he really needed to rest, otherwise he would just die. Then the guy walked over to one of the restrooms in order to get some sleep. However, when he opened the door, he didn't notice that the bug suddenly came to life and went on its way. This creature was missing half of its body, yet it did not give up and marched towards its goal. Liujin had already entered the room at this moment. He went to the refrigerator and took out a bottle of water to quench his thirst a little. He soon emptied the bottle completely, then he felt a little better. After that, the guy lay down on the soft bed and covered himself with a small blanket. In fact, he felt very good because he was very tired. He lay there for a while, recovering his strength and not thinking about anything. But soon he began to wonder what was going on in this place. He began to remember everything that had happened, that strange natural phenomenon. And then there was the sea midge. Liujin didn't understand how it was possible. Then his eyes were suddenly very tired and he couldn't stand it, so he closed them and plunged into his dreams. When the boy opened his eyes in his dream, he didn't immediately realize where he was. He saw familiar faces and voices in front of him. Some man asked who was going to raise him. A woman's voice immediately became indignant and shouted, saying she couldn't. Then the man calmly replied that he would be raising Sanha, so she might not say such words in his presence. Besides, the younger brother hears it all too. The girl, however, raised her tone even more. She said that he would live in poverty and loneliness until the end, but let him do as he sees fit. He can live his whole life with his slacker little brother. After that, the girl stamped some paper. She looked at her interlocutor for a while longer. After that, Stella got up from the table with anger and, leaving, said that he was good at breaking up other people's families after all. Liujin at this time just sat silently and watched all of this. When the girl slammed the door, he also didn't say a word, just sighed heavily. The man tried to control himself for a while. After that, he looked at the boy, smiled and asked if he was hungry. They could eat now, and at this time, Liujin suddenly sat up on the bed, breathing heavily. He clutched the blanket in his hands even from a terrible dream. When the boy mastered himself, he was very surprised and did not understand. He had just laid down for a while, but ended up falling asleep and dreaming. Liujin concluded that he was very tired, and that was why he had fallen asleep. He sat there for a while thinking about what had happened. But then he was suddenly distracted by voices coming from the corridor. But of course, he could not make out the words. He could only hear someone arguing, because the intonations were different. He went to the door and put his ear to it to make sure. Liujin was overjoyed because it meant that he was not alone. So the guy immediately touched the doorknob and decided to ask for help. But then he suddenly stopped and contemplated locking his door with an iron chain. Because when he came in, the entire floor was flooded and there was also a lot of blood, and a strange odor kept wafting into his room. The guy realized that he had just lost his mind in this environment. How could he even sleep with the door open? So he decided not to go to the people, but touching the handle of the door, he found there a special button that locked it shut. But then he suddenly changed his mind and decided to go check out the people fighting after all. Maybe he could help them. When Liujin stepped into the hallway, he saw a woman's dress and a man's silhouette. However, the voices were now hushed, and they both stood in silence. The boy was very surprised. He decided to walk closer to them, thinking that most likely they had just made up. However, he was still surprised because just now they were fighting so much. And now they were walking, holding hands, as if nothing had happened. Liujin walked closer to them. He wanted to tap the man on the shoulder then. However, he changed his mind and apologized and asked if they knew what was going on. The strangers didn't answer anything. The man slowly started to turn towards the guy and suddenly roared. Leojin felt the pungent stench again. When he saw their faces, he was very scared, because these people were also the monsters he had met before. They also had various sea parasites on their faces. The strangers smiled happily when they saw the boy. They were eager to find new prey, so they growled loudly and went on the offensive. Leojin didn't stand still for long. He immediately turned around and ran with all his might. Running away from these monsters, he didn't know what would happen next or how he should go about it. However, he only knew one thing. He had to run. Soon the boy ran to his room and slammed the door shut sharply behind him. Then, he suddenly heard a woman's voice humming a tune. Leojin didn't understand what was happening. However, he knew one thing: it was very creepy and frightened him. The woman continued to hum her tune. Then suddenly the boy heard a sharp crack. It was her hand that had punched through the wooden door. Leojin looked to the side and was very frightened. Then he saw that this hand was reaching straight for him, and he immediately started to run away. He was shaking all over. He couldn't run far, though, because suddenly he felt something crawling up his leg. He did not realize what it was. Leojin speculated that some sea acorns might have appeared on his leg as well, so he decided to check it out. And just as he started to lift his pant leg, a multitude of bugs suddenly sprinkled out of it. He didn't understand what was even going on, but he realized one thing: that they weren't sea acorns after all, but mochi. After that, the guy started yanking his legs quickly while yelling at them to get off him, but some bugs he even stepped on in the process. These bugs were climbing all over his body, even got under his shirt, so he was trying to get them from everywhere and chase them away. There were actually a lot of beetles, and they were flying in different directions with every move Leojin made. But while he was trying to chase the mochi away, the woman kept breaking down the door and bursting into his room. All the while, she was growling loudly and smiling at him. Leojin didn't like it all. He realized that his end was coming and he wouldn't have time to deal with them all at once. The woman at this point continued to rush in, and soon she could safely touch the guy's shoulder. But then suddenly the monster stopped. He heard some sounds that attracted him more than a living victim. The girl stopped barging into his room. She turned around and went to the sound she heard, continuing to hum her song. Leojin, seeing the monster running away, quickly sat down on the floor. He was unable to keep himself on his feet for much longer. The guy calmed down a lot when he saw that the monster was gone. However, his breathing was still heavy and he was sweating all over because of such stress. For a while, he sat there trying to regain his composure. Soon he calmed down and got to his feet. With relief, Leojin exhaled and thought that it was probably due to the fact that he was upstairs that the monster had left. He didn't know what it was, however. He had survived, and that was the most important thing. But then suddenly, his stomach rumbled, and he realized that he was very hungry from that time. Then Leojin started looking around the room for something edible. He didn't know if there was food in this room. When he looked over at the table where they usually cook, he saw 2 bags of 3-in-1 coffee that he had given to the gentleman quite recently. But the boy didn't think much of it. He walked over and took the coffee, thinking that it might at least dull his hunger a little. Leojin opened the bag and poured the grains into his mouth. He wanted to take something to drink, but changed his mind, remembering that he had recently drunk all the water. But he was not confused and realized that even tap water would do. So he went to the sink to drink the grains. And when he tried to open the water faucet, he couldn't do anything. He didn't understand what was happening. However, the coffee had absorbed a lot of moisture, so Leojin even felt like his throat was drying up. However, he did not know what to do in such a situation. Then he came up with another plan for himself. However, the whole time he was trying to talk himself out of the idea because it was complete nonsense to do such a thing. However, the boy was getting more and more thirsty. His mouth was so dry that he wasn't even producing drool. Leojin came to the bathroom and stood right above the toilet. He stared at it for a while, and then thought that if he took just one sip, nothing would happen to him. Then he dared after all and dunked his head into the toilet, thinking that he would only wet his throat and call it a day. However, as soon as he gulped down the water from the toilet bowl, he immediately felt sick and started spitting it out on the floor. Leojin moved farther away from the toilet, because the mere sight of it immediately makes him feel sick and want to vomit everything. Well, at that moment his stomach rumbled again and began to twist violently. He hadn't expected that, but he realized that apparently when you're too hungry, your stomach can even hurt. Leojin then began to look around for anything he could use. He looked for where else he could get a drink of water. He went to the sink that was in the bathroom. There was some water left. The guy didn't know if he was supposed to drink the water, even though it was standing water there. He noticed that there were a few hairs in there, but he thought it was a kind of squirrel. Leojin thought that perhaps he could close his eyes and drink this water in a volley like noodle soup. However, he went back and sat back down again, thinking about the fact that he didn't know if he would have drank the water with the floating goo if it had occurred to him before he drank from the toilet bowl. For some time he sat and thought. He was tormented by the agony of choice, and he didn't know what to do. Well then, he decided that the best option would be to go to the first floor. Perhaps there was something left at the counter there. He walked past the mirror, which was all broken, and thought that first of all he should find out if there were people or monsters climbing around outside. He doesn't know what it really is. Leojin then took one of the glass shards. After that, he went to the door that had a hole in it and stuck out his hand to watch what was happening on the other side. Seeing that the monsters were at the end of the hallway made him very happy. He thought to himself to keep them there and stay there. He then opened the door and began to walk out into the hallway, trying to move as quietly as possible. When he walked a little further, he saw the monster. Leojin was really sweating. He wished that creature wouldn't turn around or he would be in trouble. But then suddenly something happened that could not have been expected. A bird flew in through the open window from behind. The bird began to make loud noises. The monsters, of course, heard it and turned around to see their prey in front of them. Then the male monster, ignoring the guy, grabbed the bird by the throat and bit its head off. He bloodthirstily started eating her right in front of Leojin. The guy stood still so they wouldn't accidentally distract him. He watched the whole thing through the puddle on the floor. He stood motionless for a while. His body was shaking with fear. He realized, however, that as long as they were not distracted, he had to act. Leojin, trying to walk as quietly as possible, bypassed these monsters and went on his way. He was very scared. Well, when the guy rounded the corner, he saw that there was blood all over the place. There was broken glass somewhere, and human palm prints on the wall. Leojin looked around and realized that there was some chaos going on in this place as well. Then he read the sign on the door that said, "Administration." Of course, the guy had a key. So he went to this door and, opening it, went into an office where there were many different boxes. When he walked a little further, he saw several boxes that were filled with some kind of drink. He was immediately excited about it. Leojin walked over to the packages of noodles and got himself a drink. He began to greedily drink and eat it all because he was very hungry. It had been quite a while. Then he was all beer drinking, sodas emptying cans one by one. When he finished his meal, he sighed happily, thinking about the fact that he had survived after all. In fact, the guy had a fighting feeling that just a little more and his guts would have twisted from hunger. Taking himself some sweet popcorn, many servers, he thought about the fact that it was true what they say after all. If a man wants to live, he will survive. He then went over to the table to see what else was there and saw the key there. Leojin became very excited. He realized that it was someone's car key. Perhaps it would be his salvation. The guy tried to remember what kind of car this key could belong to. And then he remembered that it could be the key to the boss's truck, which was near the garbage sorting place. Leojin decided to take it just in case. He might need it. Then under the table he saw a canister of some kind. The boy immediately thought it might be water, so he happily went over and unscrewed the lid. As he moved closer, however, he realized it wasn't water. He guessed from the pungent odor that it was kerosene. He was a little upset that it wasn't water, but still realized that it wasn't bad either, because you could eliminate the smell and start a fire with it. Leojin took the canister. After that, he moved it under the bed and also put the lighter next to it, thinking that it would be much better in case of anything. After that, the guy looked around the room, thinking about the fact that he had managed to feed his stomach by some miracle after all. However, he didn't know what he should do next. Lee Ojin thought about whether it would be better to go straight to the police or to the hospital. But he put those thoughts aside for later, deciding that the most important thing at the moment was to get out of the monster's lair. The boy began to think about an escape plan. He remembered that he had welded the front door on the first floor, so there was no way to open it. Lee Ojin realized that he probably wouldn't be able to go to the second floor again. Then he decided to go out into the hallway and examine it more closely. Maybe he'd find something better. So he started looking around each room, and when he saw the doors to the men's room, he realized that he could get out through the window. There he could get through. After finding a place to go, he returned to the office because he realized it was very dangerous to go without arming himself in any way. Lee Ojin looked around the room carefully and got himself some duct tape, a stick, and a knife. Then he tied the knife to the stick and decided to try to see how it would stab. Then the boy was sure of his weapon already. He stepped quietly out into the hallway, carefully opening the door. When he was sure that no one was there, he ran out and went straight to his place of rescue. However, when he went into the men's room, he saw that everything was covered in those marine parasites, and some shards of glass were still in the frame. Lee Ojin was horrified at the sight of all this and didn't understand how he would get through it. The guy was really worried. He didn't know what he was doing, and he didn't have much time, because the monster was not far away. But then he suddenly heard footsteps behind him, and when he turned around, he saw a blonde monster girl who was also humming songs. A girl. Perhaps if she hadn't become a monster, she would have even been beautiful. However, with sea parasites on her face and a torn shirt covered in blood, she looked horrifying. Lee Ojin looked around and saw that there were many such monsters in the stalls. They were all doing something over the toilets. For a while, the monsters sat there and paid no attention. However, the guy made a sound, and they immediately turned viciously, snarling at him. The monsters finished their 5-song. Then, in a hoarse voice, they asked the boy to give them water. Lee Ojin was very frightened. He just stood there and watched as they approached him. The boy didn't know what to do. However, as soon as the monster girl already wanted to attack him, he chopped off her head with his weapon, even breaking the stick. However, there was nothing after that blow to the girl. She continued walking towards him as if nothing had happened. However, blood appeared on the back of her head. Lee Ojin looked at his shattered means of defense and thought that it was all completely useless to do this. Then he started running towards the door, thinking that he had no other choice. The monsters crawled after him. Lee Ojin ran out into the corridor, and the blonde-haired monster girl ran straight after him. She was about to catch up with him, but then he saw the door that was locked from the inside. At first, he didn't notice the lock. When he ran closer and tried to open the door, he realized that it was the same one he had failed to open the first time. He couldn't waste a second because the monsters were getting closer. So he quickly turned around and turned into the corridor where the stairs with elevators were. He didn't have time to wait for the elevator, so Lee Ojin immediately started climbing the stairs. He decided it would be better to jump out of the window on the second floor. The guy thought that if he grouped himself correctly, he wouldn't even break anything. However, as soon as his foot stepped onto the second floor, he immediately saw 2 more monsters in front of him who were watching him after hearing the sounds. Lee Ojin was very frightened. He didn't know where to run to, because there were new ones waiting for him in front of him, and the same girl was running behind him. He thought that he was in an ambush with no way out. But at that moment, he suddenly heard some strange sounds coming from above. He looked at the ceiling for a while, trying to figure out what was going on. However, Lee Ojin then looked at the monsters who were also distracted by this sound. The guy realized that they were being stopped by that noise. This was his chance. If he didn't take it, it would be too late. Lee Ojin turned around and ran towards one of the doors. He pulled his keys out of his pocket with trembling hands. Then he opened the door to the room. The guy opened the door abruptly, and when he ran in, he immediately slammed it shut and leaned on it to hold it open. After that, he exhaled in relief, thinking that he had gotten lucky this time after all. For a while, he just sat there motionless, trying to figure out what to do next. But then he heard some strange noises in his room. And looking around, Lee Ojin saw something he certainly didn't expect. A girl hanging in the air. She was dead. The boy was in shock. He put his hand over his mouth to keep from screaming and attracting the monsters. After calming down a bit, he saw that her things were lying next to the girl. The guy couldn't believe that she had killed herself. But then suddenly he noticed among the things at her dead feet a piece of paper that caught his attention. Very interested, Jin picked it up and started reading. There, the girl was addressing her mother and apologizing for failing the entrance exam. The stranger asked if it could be worse. She felt as if the whole world had collapsed at once. She apologized to her mother and father, for they believed and supported her in everything and made her study hard. However, she disappointed them by getting terrible grades. But the girl wrote that it was very hard and lonely, too scary for her. However, they cannot worry because she is together with Yongju until the very end. After that, she said goodbye. Jin was very surprised when he read the letter to the end. He thought that he too had only passed the civil servant exam from the 5th time. However, it was worth living a little longer. However, at this moment, he heard someone screaming in the corridor and monsters roaring again. Jin sighed heavily and said to himself that there was chaos happening everywhere. But then he pushed the bad thoughts away from him and realized that for the moment he had to try to survive first and foremost, and he would worry about other things later. Jin looked at the letter for a while longer and put it aside. Then he went over to the girl's bag and looked through it to see if he could find anything useful. And so, when he put his hand in his bag, he fumbled for his phone, and when he took it out, he was very happy because he really needed it. However, when he looked up, he saw that he had very little charge left on him. On the main screen, the guy had a lot of different notifications popping up. Most of them were from his mother, who was very worried about not being able to reach her daughter. However, there were also high-hazard earthquake notices out there, several of them. Jin, after reading all this, was shocked. He locked his phone so as not to waste the charge. In fact, he didn't even have anything to say about it. In the last message, the girl's mother asks her to respond. The woman knows that her daughter is offended, but she does not want her to do that to her own mother. Then he suddenly remembered the words of the note and decided to double-check. He went over and reread it again. At the end, it was written that the girl wasn't scared because Yongju was with her until the end. He was very surprised because it said that she was together. Then Jin realized that this girl was not alone. There were 2 of them. This made him very scared, even his hands shook with fear. But at that moment, he heard some sounds coming from the corridor. He was very frightened, not understanding what was happening. However, as he listened more closely, he realized that this sound wasn't coming from outside, it was somewhere nearby. And at that moment, the door that leads to the bathroom opened, and the silhouette of a man appeared from there. He was also wearing these sea parasites, and in a hoarse voice the guy said he was very scared. There was actually a rope wrapped around his neck. Jin was startled and moved farther away. Not knowing what was going on, he assumed that it was probably her boyfriend. The stranger was approaching him, trying to say something. Then the boy realized that he was no longer human, but just like all the other monsters. At this moment, Jin picked up a special scented disc from the floor and lit it with a lighter, thinking that he didn't know exactly, however, it would probably remove the smell. After that, he dropped the thing not far away from him. The monster was immediately attracted to it. In a hoarse voice, the monster said something about the entrance exam and the university, and kept talking about how he was very scared. The monster had already stopped paying his attention to the scented disc and went on the offensive again at the guy, saying he wanted to live. Jin was pushing himself backwards. However, he didn't notice as he stepped on the remote control and turned on the TV. There was an emergency broadcast program on. At this moment, the weather TV behind Jin lit up, and the guy immediately took notice. The anchor said that in the southern part of the metropolitan area, where the effects of the typhoon have not yet disappeared, the strong earthquake caused additional damage. The sound of the TV was very loud, so the other monsters reacted to it too and ran to the door. They started banging on it hard, trying to kick it open. Soon they did manage to do it, though, and a number of different creatures ran into the room and wanted to kill the guy. Jin saw this and panicked. He didn't know where to hide or where to run, so he grabbed a blanket from the bed and covered himself with it. At this moment, he thought that he had reacted quite well, and he had also set fire to the special scented disc, so the monsters wouldn't have to find it. It was indeed true. The monsters paid absolutely no attention to him. They ran past and pounced on the girl who had hung herself. Leo Jin, seeing this, mentally apologized to her. However, he couldn't waste such a moment, so he started to run away himself, saving his life. As soon as he ran out into the hallway, he immediately covered his mouth with his hand so as not to attract the attention of the monsters, of which there were quite a few. However, his scent still attracted them, and a multitude of creatures immediately took notice of him. Lee Ojin ran onward despite being chased by all of them. However, as soon as he turned to another corridor or ran to another floor, he found even more monsters. Every time the guy climbed higher and higher, he was met by monsters. He didn't understand what was happening and why there were so many of them. And as he ran up the last floor, he realized that he needed to find a passage to the roof. Maybe there he could escape them. Before long, Lee Ojin still made it to the roof exit. He was very disappointed to see that it was completely covered with tables and chairs. The guy was in shock. He stood there without moving. Then he heard other monsters coming up behind him, wanting to eat him. Lee Ojin had nowhere else to run. He realized that this was the end of him. He couldn't escape. Then he remembered his brother and mentally apologized to him, thinking about how he had ruined everything again. And he would have liked to see his niece at least once more. Lee Ojin felt very disappointed. After remembering all of this, however, he then overcame his feelings and clenched his hand into a fist and thought about the fact that he could not die on this day. After all, he still owes his brother so much. Lee Ojin can't just walk away. He has to live. The monsters were already closing in on him. There were more and more of them. However, the guy was not going to give up. He started to motivate himself and told himself that he could do anything. And so, when he was about to go on the offensive and kill these monsters, he suddenly heard someone's voice. It was the voice of a small child. He turned to the uncle and told him to go to him. Leo Jin was very surprised to hear this. He thought that he had even imagined it and wanted to return to the fight. However, the child crawled further and told the boy to follow him faster. After all, there was no time left at all. Leo Jin didn't waste a moment then. He followed the child through a small tunnel lined with barricades. However, as soon as he started to climb, he suddenly rolled backwards, saying that there was something slippery there. He struggled and tried to climb higher and higher, but then suddenly, one of the monsters grabbed his foot and started pulling him down. Lee Ojin pressed with his foot and shouted for the monster to let go of him already, but he couldn't do anything. Then a stick with a sword at the end flashed by his head and struck the monster in the face. Lee Ojin was very surprised. However, he didn't waste any time and crawled further. When he was on the other side of the room, he rejoiced, saying that they had succeeded after all. When he got out of the tunnel, he saw the girl in front of him. She pulled the blanket off him and plugged the hole behind him. After that, she took a can of kerosene and doused the cloth with it. Lee Ojin crawled away so as not to disturb her. However, he was very surprised by the girl's actions. At this moment, the guy wondered if the monsters were still following him. However, he then decided that he shouldn't worry. They must have lost his trail. Lee Ojin looked around the room and saw a hair conditioner on the shelf. He wondered why the girl needed it. The stranger said that if you mix it with rainwater and sprinkle it, it makes it slippery, and the local odor can be removed with ease. She was holding a stick with a knife on the end of it. She looked proudly at the guy and explained that if you acted this way, all the monsters would leave. Lee Ojin was very surprised. He sat on the floor and fearfully asked how the girl knew all this. The stranger replied that the monsters had also raided before, and she had tried this method. After the girl hit the floor with the stick, making loud noises, Lee Ojin sat and watched it all. And when the girl finished doing so, he looked at her happily and said that meant that this was where that noise had come from. She was surprised and asked if it had helped him. The boy replied that of course it did, because it had saved him several times. But suddenly a man's voice interrupted their conversation. He shouted at the girl, addressing her by her name Sul B, and told her to come over to him. Lee Ojin turned at the voice and saw that they were not alone. There were several other people standing next to them. The man in front of her started yelling and said that he had told her he couldn't help anyone anymore and asked what if this guy wasn't infected. Lee Ojin realized that it was about him. Then he came closer and asked if they were all students. The guy replied that they were actually all from Hanguk University and had come to this place as a group, but a university trip. Lee Ojin asked in surprise, wondering if they had really arrived at the motel. The student smiled and said that was correct. It was just that they had a close relative who knew the director of the motel. They were actually going to go to a boarding house, but they stayed at this place, paying for the entire 5th floor. Sulbi agreed with her classmate and said that after that, those monsters suddenly appeared. At first, they were at least able to fend them off, but later the monsters got in after all. During this time, they had learned that if you were bitten or scratched in any way, you would become infected and become like them. When Lee Ojin heard this, he realized that it was possible to get infected by these monsters after all. The girl agreed with the man, or asked if he had been bitten or scratched anywhere because that's very important for them to know. There are a lot of lives at stake. She also said that she needed to check at least once to be sure for sure. However, a guy suddenly interrupted their conversation. The student looked at them indignantly and said that he was actually in charge of the place. At that moment, there was a heavy rumbling sound, followed by banging on the door. The boy pointed to the door handle, which kept jerking because the monsters were trying to break through. He told Lee Ojin that on the other side of the door were guys from their faculty who had been infected. They're not the same now as they used to be, and he doesn't know how it happened because everyone was drunk. One thing he is sure of, however, is that things got weird right after the heavy downpour started. Lee Ojin, as if he wasn't listening to him, interrupted the guy and asked how they even cooked the food. The students looked at him angrily, not understanding what the question was about now, but the boy smiled and told them not to think anything of the sort. He refreshed himself with ramen and canned coffee. The student looked at their new guest carefully, and pronouncing each word separately told him to leave. Lee Ojin was very surprised when he heard this. He didn't understand why they suddenly decided to kick him out. But Sulbi stood in front of him. She turned to the guy and said that actually the situation outside wasn't so favorable to kick him out. However, the student was not going to listen to her. He said indignantly that this is the way he actually talks. And he actually said that in the beginning. They were holding on, consuming sparingly purchased snacks and water, but that didn't mean they could handle another person. The girl couldn't take it anymore either, and started raising her voice, saying that they would actually help him for nothing. This guy might know how to get out of this place. However, the student did not want to listen to her. He told her to look at him at all, because it was obvious that he was a common bum. He asked what she thought a man she met on such an island could help them with, but Sulbi insisted and said that nevertheless they should listen first and then judge. He might also know what's going on outside the building, and that could help them. The student was still indignant. He sighed heavily, and everyone was silent for a while. He then spoke to the guy and asked that he introduce himself so they could figure out what to do next. Lee Ojin was silent for a while. After that, he said that he was actually looking out for a sea path on another island that wasn't that far away from this one. When the student heard this, he was very surprised. He didn't think the boy would be a civil servant. However, he said that in that case, let him say everything down to the organization of his duties and his name. Lee Ojin was very surprised, and when he wanted to call his name, a girl approached him and asked him how his leg was. She said that he had been bitten on the end of his shoe recently, hadn't he? Lee Ojin looked at his foot and said that it was actually fine. There was a bite mark on his shoe. The students, hearing this, were silent. They looked suspiciously at the civil servant, but Sulbi said his name. After that, she said that since he was working at the lighthouse, he must have a good knowledge of the neighborhood. The girl said that she entered Hanguk University in the 20th year, and at the moment she is 21 years old. Then a student spoke up. He said that it was not necessary to know his name. However, he could just call him Head. Lee Ojin turned to him and asked if he could find out their ages. His way of speaking is a little army style. The Head sighed heavily and said he was 22 years old. He is a cadet in the Reserve Officer Training Corps. Suddenly another student approached them. He apologized for interrupting, They all immediately turned around to see what he wanted. A guy came down from the top floor. He looked at the head and asked if he could go already. Some girl was holding him back. He wasn't feeling well. His case was shaky. The student said he was feeling very ill, so his girlfriend would introduce herself for both of them. He was not feeling well at all. There were severe bruises under his eyes. Yes, and throwing sweat, the guy turned around and apologized for that, then started walking back. When the guy went upstairs, his girlfriend stayed behind. She turned around and looked straight at the civil servant. Then she came close enough that she could feel his breath, gave him an angry look, and called his name. It was Huang Ga-ai, and her boyfriend's name is No One Bin. She explained that he was in a very bad condition at the moment. However, it has not actually been bitten or scratched by anyone, so there is no need to worry, and there are no marine parasites on its body either. After that, she calmed down a bit, waved to everyone, and said that she would be on her way. Lee Ojin was very surprised, but he said that since she had to, she could go. When the girls started to rise, he didn't understand what was going on because this whole situation was basically strange. But then, suddenly another guy spoke to him. He said his name was Kwon Seong-tae and he was a 19th grade law student. That's when the girl spoke up. She thought that she had actually come for a magazine photo shoot, and in the end, there was a lot of confusion. But she said that her name was Cha Ye-young, a 21st-year student in the aviation department. Sul B turned to the civil servant and said that they all had no idea how things turned into such a nightmare because they were very drunk. And when they woke up, they immediately saw the monsters. So they made the decision to barricade themselves together. There are probably still other surviving students outside. But then suddenly the girl remembered what she had completely forgotten to ask, and asked Lee Ojin how he had gotten into this place. After all, the students had locked the door from the inside with chains. She asked in surprise with a drop of hope, "Is there really another entrance somewhere else that they didn't know about?" Lee Ojin calmly said that he actually snuck in through the emergency exit on the second floor. The girl asked in surprise, "Is there really such a thing there?" The head said he hadn't really heard anything useful and asked the guy if he could just leave. Lee Ojin calmly said that he actually understood everything. The girl looked at him in surprise. She thought he would stay after all. Lee Ojin at this moment thought that under any circumstances he wasn't going to linger in this place, so it was best for him to hurry up and go to his brother's place. At this point he turned back to the passage he had entered through. She was still covered by the blanket, and he just watched for a while. He then turned to the students and said that he would probably leave right then and there. And so, when he had already removed the blanket and wanted to climb in, a girl suddenly approached him. When Sulbi turned to him, he immediately turned around and saw her holding out another package of noodles and water to him. The girl told him to take it. Lee Ojin wasn't going to refuse, so he accepted her favor and thanked her for it. Then she asked what he planned to do next, where he was going to go, how he was going to be saved. Lee Ojin replied that he would probably look for a boat or dinghy at the dock first. It was nearby. Soon he was downstairs. Then he looked out into the hallway to see if there were any strangers. But there was no one there. The boy was surprised. He didn't realize that the infected had disappeared so easily. Lee Ojin realized that if he moved quietly, he could easily get out of this place. The girl suddenly turned to him and asked him what would happen if there were more of them near the motel. The guy looked at her. After that, he said reassuringly that it would be okay. There was a car in the parking lot. But then suddenly, the head came out to them and told him to stop. His voice sounded very angry. The student asked in surprise, "Does he really have a car? If he does, they're going to have a completely different conversation." Sol B whispered to the civil servant that he changed his mind because he couldn't drive. Lee Ojin actually immediately thought so, and the leader continued speaking and added that in fact their food and water supplies had almost run out. And they don't have any medicine, so they plan to go to the pharmacy at the end of the street, and none of them know anything about cars. Lee Ojin replied that he understood about the food, but what they needed the medicine for in the first place. The head looked at the girl who had a sick boyfriend and asked the civil servant if he remembered the kid who could barely stand on his feet. So he lives on the necessary, where comments. because otherwise he doesn't have long to live. At that moment, the head led the civil servant into the room where the sick guy was lying just like that. When Lee Ojin saw him, he asked the girl, "Is he sick?" She said that at the moment he had a cold and his stomach was cramping up all the time. The guy was really sick. He was sweating on the bed and twisting from side to side. He said that his stomach was very twisted, and it felt like his insides were being cut from the inside. The head was already hesitating and asked the girl if she was sure he was safe. She was indignant and replied that of course he was not contagious. However, the head still insisted, reserving his opinion, and said that after all, she had seen the visions of their other companions. They were being twisted, just as he was. But the girl was indignant and said it was impossible to get infected without a single wound. Even now, she carefully checked his skin to know for sure. Sungtae intervened in their conversation and told the chapter that it actually sounded lame. The head agreed with him and said that the guy was making a good point. Apparently, this couple is covering for each other on purpose to stay. Then the girl couldn't take it anymore. She got out of bed and started screaming, asking even louder, "How many more times can they say it? If he doesn't believe it, he can look." The guy, who was still lying in bed in pain, looked at the head and said that no one had really bitten him. He was just always lurking behind. The girl felt very sorry for her boyfriend. She was very much in love with him, and to see him in such a state was the worst for her. Then she turned to the others and told them all to leave the room. Only she has the right to see her boyfriend naked. The girls turned around. One of them started to resent him and told her to shut up already. Even for $1 million, her head wouldn't turn in his direction for any reason. Lee Ojin, watching all of this, thought that perhaps he too should quickly leave this room and save himself. In fact, he would never have thought he would have to examine a stripped man. And at that moment the patient's clothes flew in his direction. The head, along with Sun Tae, walked over and began to examine the sick guy. The head told his partner to examine him closely from behind. The guy became indignant and asked, "Is it really necessary?" The sick man's girlfriend kept supporting him the whole time, saying she loved him even terribly emaciated, and he was holding up well. After a while their inspection was finished. The head hesitated and said that indeed there was not a scratch on him. Huang Ga-ai went to the civil servant and asked if he was going to go to the store with them. Her boyfriend has a very weak immune system, so the illness can progress very quickly. They urgently need to find medicine. Liujin didn't say anything to this. He just stood there and watched the whole thing, wondering what the right thing to do was. Then the leader turned to him and said that soon they would have nothing left to eat. He looked at him hopefully and asked if he would help. Liujin didn't know how best to proceed. On the one hand, they could kind of be trusted. However, it would be easier for him to just continue his journey alone. Then he looked at those students again and wondered what decision he should make after all. After that, he sighed heavily and said okay, he would help them after all. He would stay until they got sustenance. Sulbi returned to the room and said that in that case, one should avoid the monsters when they get out. This motel has only 5 floors and 32 rooms. Among them, the second and third were packed with guests. But on the 4th floor, most of the rooms were vacant, and the 5th was fully rented. Lee Ojin, hearing all of this, was surprised and asked how on earth she knew this. The girl replied that she was the deputy and secretary of the head, and she was tasked with making the reservation. And since they were disturbing everyone else because of their partying, the administration made concessions. Let the visitors only go to the 3rd and 2nd floors. Sulbi also said that quite a few infected people were downstairs that day. However, they do not know where they are now. Lee Ojin, after hearing all of this, realized that apparently the only one who knew the current situation of the building at the moment was him. Then, the guy started to remember where he had seen the monsters while he was running to the roof. There were quite a few, a whole crowd, on the 1st floor, namely in the restroom. The 2nd floor was just a husband and wife, and the 3rd floor was a whole family. The 4th also has a sweet couple walking around. However, that was when the guy first arrived at the building. Things could have changed in the meantime. For a while they just stood there in silence, wondering what they should do. But then suddenly the girl said that she had thought of a plan. Sulbi said she would explain the details to them in the lobby, and asked that they bring their cell phones with them. The head asked indignantly, What are they for since they are of no use? Lee Ojin, while they were arguing, slowly began to move away from them. Then he went into the other room. When he came in, he saw that there was some kind of pot on the stove, and looking into it, he was horrified, because there were some creatures lying in that pot that also had sea parasites on them. He was very surprised to see it. The guy was trying to make out what was there, but then suddenly Sul B came out to him, and while watching him, she asked, "Where is he looking at?" Lee Ojin was a little scared when he saw her. He didn't expect the girl to follow him. However, he immediately asked what was in the pot. She explained that it was leftovers from last time, and kind of even called it oyster soup. The civil servant asked in surprise, "And who ate it anyway?" The girl hesitated, trying to remember. Before long, she said she couldn't say for sure. However, each room has different dishes, and it was probably eaten by everyone. Lee Ojin anxiously stood up and looked at the girl, then asked, "Did she really eat it too?" Sul B said no, not at all. They had chapaguri, which is a Korean dish made of noodles and soybeans. After all, she's not a seafood lover. Hearing this information, the civil servant looked again at these oysters that were in the pot. He thought about what he saw. In fact, the guy really hoped that his suspicions would be false. After all, if they weren't, things wouldn't end well. It was still raining outside, and it didn't even think about stopping. Everything in the neighborhood was soaked to the skin. Soon, everyone brought their phones. Then the girl commanded and ordered them to tie them together. One of the students found some rope and started tying the phones to each other. Soon, the deed was done. Then the girl took them and threw them one by one out of the window. The result was a long rope that reached all the way to the bottom. Sul B, seeing the incomprehension on her allies' faces, explained that in exactly 3 minutes, the alarms would go off and attract the monsters to the windows. Before throwing the phone out the window, the girl had set an alarm on each phone, so she said that as soon as they heard the signal, they should move out immediately. However, she pointed to the window and added that one person should still remain to hold that rope. Then the head spoke, and he said he would volunteer to hold the rope. He explained that such a task would require someone who could pull the honeycomb back in time with quick reflexes and such. Then he suddenly turned to Ga-ai and said that she was scared of other girls walking around next to Bin, right? The girl laughed awkwardly and said what she was doing was completely beside the point. Sul B didn't listen to them. She turned to another girl named Ye Young and asked if she really didn't want to go. The girl with red hair turned away and said she would probably refuse such a favor. Sul B was still trying to talk her down, telling her to go, after all. The more people, the better it would be. However, Ye Yon said that if she went out with them, she would probably get in the way underfoot, so let them just go and don't worry. She wouldn't drink or eat the food they didn't bring. The girl objected and said they were actually going to share with everyone, and asked if maybe she just wasn't feeling well. Ye Young got really angry. She kicked her foot on the floor and said that it was just a creepy thumping sound, and those monsters are sensitive to such things after all. And since it's going to go fast, it's going to be quite loud, and she doesn't want to go boss somehow, so she'd rather stay after all. Sul B now realized that it was useless to beg her, so she agreed, and soon everyone who was going to go came to the exit to get ready. Lee Ojin stopped at the exit. He turned to the others and asked if they had remembered to put on hair conditioner to get rid of the smell. The guys who walked with him said they were drenched head to toe in it. No odor was certainly left behind. The civil servant said it was just fine. Then he took the cloth and pushed the exit back again. Before climbing inside and going downstairs, he assumed there was no one in the hallway at the moment, and hoped everything would be okay. He waited a while longer, and then suddenly he heard a distant tune. It was the alarm clock they had set. A children's tune played there, trying to wake the man up. Soon other alarm clocks went off as well. The boys waved to each other as a sign that it was okay to go, and then started on their way. The monsters at this moment, who were busy searching for their prey, suddenly heard this sound as well and were immediately distracted by it. Lee Ojin, who came down first, looked down the hallway and saw the two of them banging on the windows to get that sound. He waved to everyone else, indicating that the path was clear. The guy had a gun in his hands, as he was the first to go. The students were quite scared, but they tried not to lose their composure. As they approached the monsters, Sul B whispered to the civil servant, and said that they hadn't noticed them yet. The boy didn't bother to answer her. He just waved his head in agreement, and then they went on their way. But just as he was about to open the door to go down the stairs, one of the monsters ran out at them. They were all very frightened. Lee Ojin didn't understand where he was even coming from. Then the girl suggested that he probably didn't hear the ringtone because of the sea parasites that had grown in his ears. The students panicked. They turned to the master, asking what they should do now. Lee Ojin was worried himself, but the children were hoping for him, so he grabbed his weapon harder and swung at the monster. The beast didn't pay attention to him for a while. Then he felt a strong push. Lee Ojin hit him so hard that he even hit the door with his back. When the monster came to his senses and went on the offensive again, the guy pushed him into the stairwell that led outside. Lee Ojin hit it so hard that the monster rolled down the steps straight down. Then he shouted to all the other students to take this chance and run away quickly. Everyone, of course, started running without losing their chance. The guy also added that they might even be accused of murder later. One of the students protested and said that he was already dead and that this could be considered self-defense. But at that moment, the monster reacted and grabbed Huang Gae's foot. The girl, sensing this, immediately stopped and screamed, saying that he had grabbed her foot. Then the monster also wheezed. He said something about his car and looked at the girl greedily. She shouted to Sung Dae and told him not to just stand there, but to help her. However, the boy was very frightened. He stammered and asked what he could do to help her. Sul Bi wasn't going to stand still for long. She grabbed a can and a lighter. Then she ran up to the monster and made a fiery blast right into its face. The shirt he was wearing immediately caught fire. The monster fell to the ground and started screaming loudly in pain. Then the students started running away again, telling them to hurry up. They soon ran out into the parking lot. Lee Ojin stopped, and when he saw the car, he shouted happily that he had found it. The students came running right after him. Then the man went over and looked under the car to see what was there. However, there was nothing there. This pleased him. So he went inside and said that she needed to be started up as quickly as possible before the monsters reacted. Huang Ga-ai ran up to the back where the guy was already sitting. She hissed at him, asking if he could bail out his own lady. He's such a no-brainer. However, the guy, who was already in his seat and didn't move, told her to just climb in carefully. Lee Ojin, seeing that all the students had taken their seats, quickly started the car and began to drive away from the parking lot. At this time, the phones kept making their alarm sounds, thus attracting the monsters. However, soon the music stopped, and the monsters heard a car coming out of the backyard, so they ran straight after it. Sul Bi, who was sitting next to the driver and looked out the window, said that the alarm clock had actually delayed them quite well, however. They were already following them. At that moment, she returned to your seat again and took out a bottle of water. Lee Ojin, seeing this, asked in surprise what she needed it for. The girl explained that quite recently, she had read in a scientific journal that hunters throw their hair to distract their prey. It was in the bottle that a few of Sul Bi's hairs lay. She thinks monsters have a good sense of smell, so she decided to give it a try. Many of the monsters' faces looked unfamiliar, so she wondered if this was the place where all the infected from around the area flocked. She began to look closely at the faces of these people and said it was just disgusting. However, in the model, the situation is probably better now. After all, they're all running for the car. She watched it for a while. Then she said that all the infected people must have left the building. Lee Ojin, hearing this, shifted his speed and said that in that case, they were going to the supermarket now. Then he sped up. While they were driving, Sul Bi looked out the window again. She saw that the monster had started to get closer. She decided to test the hunter's method and started pouring water on the pavement. The monsters kept running. For a while, they were distracted. However, they still didn't stop. Sul Bi, observing all of this, asked the civil servant what kind of creatures these were in the first place. Lee Ojin said they look a lot like barnacles, marine parasites. He doesn't know where it started. However, it is very much like the zombie virus from the movies. Someone bites you or scratches you and the mutation starts. The virus gets into your bloodstream and you turn into someone just like them. They're even lucky they're slow enough, because if they were even a little bit faster, it's unlikely they'd be able to pull it off. The girl suddenly remembered the mainland and said that the situation was probably better on the mainland. They could get help if they contacted the outside world. Lee Ojin noticed that the girl was trembling all over, especially her hands. She was very scared. Then he told her not to worry, because once they got off the island, everything would be fine. Soon he turned a corner. The car was hard enough to drive, for all the roads were unpaved, and it was hard for the car to get through them. Lee Ojin also said that he wouldn't envy those sitting in the back. They drove straight through the water because of the heavy rain, and the road turned into mud. Sul-bi looked out the window and looked at all that water and said, "Apparently it's not working for us either. It's supposed to remove water from the surface of the ground." They were driving on, when suddenly the guy saw a cat jumping down from a high place. And when he looked more closely, he saw a man standing by the trash can. He was also infected, and noticing the animal creature, immediately tried to attack him to eat. However, the cat managed to react in time and ran away from him. The creature was very upset about not being able to catch the cat. Then it suddenly began to wheeze and said that it wanted water very badly. The monster then took the garbage bag and started licking the remnants of the water droplets that were there. Sul-bi, who had also noticed all this, asked if the lack of water would affect them. Lee Ojin said, probably, because if you think about it, in the model, they all gathered around the toilets on the first floor. At this point, he thought about it and realized that the rain was over, and now the question was how long the weather would be clear. Soon they pulled up in front of the store, and the guy quickly turned the steering wheel to stand right next to the entrance. When the car stopped, the students immediately got out of it to get their supplies. Lee Ojin stayed in the car for a while. He doubted they had much time before the next rain. When they came to the entrance, he began to examine the store carefully. The glass there was unbroken, despite the large amount of blood and scratches. And when he saw just an open door, he was surprised and thought that most likely the employees, seeing all this chaos, had fled. After that, he went back to the car to retrieve the bags, at which point the guy stepped on a puddle. He did not pay much attention to it. Suddenly he heard a great rumbling sound, and when he looked to the side, he saw a huge wave coming straight toward them. Lee Ojin, upon seeing this, realized that the sea level had risen, and it was much different from when he first sailed to the island. The department is on high ground, so it wasn't that noticeable. But now that they've come into town, it's immediately noticeable. Sul-bi suddenly turned to him. She held out her weapon and said that they had already arrived. Hwang Ga-e ran forward. She said she wanted to get medicine for her lover first, so she turned to her boyfriend and told him to wait for her at that spot. She would find the pills and come right back. The guy objected and said that technically it was theft of medicines, which is punishable by probation or even imprisonment. Lee Ojin followed the girls and said that in that case it couldn't be helped. If they took too much, they would just leave the money at the cash register. Soon they approached the store, which looked very creepy from the outside because of those blood marks and scratches on its glass. However, they did not stop. The lights, of course, were not working because of the severe flooding. Soon, they began to pass by the food departments looking for something they needed. Lee Ojin, going behind the cash register, suddenly saw a faucet. He went over to check something. He already wanted to test his hypothesis. However, when he opened the faucet, no water came out, and he realized that it didn't work. Then the man thought that this situation was very similar to the one in the motel. But then suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a woman's voice. She said that she had found something to take with her to drink. Lee Ojin opened his bag and said that it was just fine. Then he walked over to pick up some provisions. The man also told them to also take plenty of fluids just in case, because that's the most important thing. Sul-bi, who was picking up the food, said that she would do everything. Then the civil servant approached her and said that if the noodles had expired, let her not take them for now. He also suggested that she should prefer canned foods or dried fruits. The girl was surprised and asked if he had thought of all this on the way to the store. Lee Ojin said that in fact, time was not a rubber band either, and there might be other survivors. So he thought about what he should take with him first. The man explained that working at the lighthouse had taught him to prioritize efficiency. At that moment, he picked up a can of dog food. The girl, seeing this, told him about it. However, he said it was completely unimportant, because anything can come in handy. Sul B mentally agreed with him, and realized that there was no difference between humans and dogs at the moment. Then the girl shifted her gaze to one of the shelves, and she was interested in one item, so she went to grab it. When she had already approached, she turned to the gentleman and asked him what he would say about it. Li Ojin, who was standing nearby, didn't see what she was pointing at, so he decided to walk over to see what she wanted. And so, when the girl took that product in her hands, he saw that she was holding a whiskey and smiling happily at that. He then, with a lowered voice, said that it was a bit much. Sulbi was a little upset, but said that maybe it really wasn't worth it. She had already put the bottle back on the counter. Then the man wondered whether they should take the alcohol with them. Li Ojin stopped the girl and said that she could take one bottle after all. After all, he didn't see it as such a big deal. Sul B was very surprised when she heard this. She turned to the man and asked why he suddenly changed his mind. Does he really want to use it for disinfection? However, he said, turning around, that there was actually little alcohol in this alcohol for sanitizing. However, it might have other uses. The girl thought about it for a while, and then she obeyed the civil servant and put the bottle in her bag. After that, they began to get more food. Then the girl suddenly wondered and asked him why he only took a few things from what he put in the basket. Li Ojin replied that it was because it was possible that others would join them, so it was better to have a little more provisions. Sulbi put the drink in her bag and said that they actually have a lot in common, so it turns out that he is also soft-hearted and willing to help people in need. She smiled, looking him straight in the face, and said that she actually takes some things for other reasons, but the overall result is the same. Li Ojin was also looking at the girl. However, he was very surprised that she was saying that she was taking things for other reasons. He didn't understand what she meant, but suddenly an outraged Huang Ga-ai passed by them. She started shouting, asking where the medicine was because she couldn't find it. Then she turned to the guy behind her and asked if he had found the pills for himself. Song Dae-woo, who had his hands full of water, said that he was doing other things right now. The girl became even more indignant and asked what he meant. For starters, he could have at least pretended to be looking for something. The boy sighed heavily and then said that she had already said that she had looked everywhere but had found nothing. Why make such a scene now? Song Dae walked a little further and said that there was a good chance that they would be on the counter. However, he quickly fell silent when he saw the state of the store. Huang Ga-ai was very surprised, but then she went over to the refrigerators and saw that some were still unharmed after all. She studied the medicine carefully and found what she was looking for after all, so she took it. The girl took not only what she needed, but also some other medicines and put them on the table to look at. Huang Ga-ai decided to take some just in case because her honey doesn't like pills, so she's going to take more liquids. Then she turned to the guy and told him to take whatever was there. The trip had been exhausting enough, and she wished she could go back. Sung Dai agreed with her. Then he went to the cash register to get some more things. He felt resentful because he didn't understand why the girl kept asking him to get more things. But the moment he was about to take what he needed, he was suddenly grabbed from behind by someone's hand, and huge claws scratched his skin until it was bloody. The guy was really scared. When he looked to see who it was, he saw a man. The man hissed angrily as he greeted him. Song Dae didn't immediately realize what was happening. However, he soon felt a sharp pain in his arm as the monster began to run its huge claws over his skin. Soon, he still managed to break free from the monster's grip and fell behind the counter. A lot of blood was pouring out of his arm, and he didn't know what to do. Song Dae tried to crawl towards his friends. However, he was in too much pain because he had lost a lot of blood, and the monster was about to follow him. The boy couldn't contain his emotions. He was too scared, so he even started crying. Then he heard closer and closer the monster's voice telling him not to litter. And soon after, he pounced on the poor guy. Song Dae cried out loudly in pain and fear. He started to beg for someone to come to his rescue. But at that moment, the monster's claws were digging into his face, and his feet were pounding on his body. Song Dae cried out in pain. However, no one came to his aid, and soon the monster was digging its bloody teeth right into the skin on his neck. The guy looked at the girl who had come running in screaming and asking for help. However, she just stood there and watched the whole thing. Huang Ga-ai was in shock. She was trembling with fear. She said in a quiet voice that she had to go back to her boyfriend. So let him take care of himself. After that, she started running away, and while screaming, she apologized to the guy. She also said that if Won Bin gets better, it's only because of him. Lee Ojin, hearing all this shouting, looked around the corner and saw what was happening. Then he hid behind the counter, thinking about his plans of action. He realized he needed to help that guy and said it out loud, addressing the student. However, Sol B stopped him, telling the gentleman that it was too late and there was nothing that could be done. It was the end. She reminded her that once someone was bitten or scratched, there was no saving them. It was the same with her classmates. The civil servant already wanted to object to something. However, the girl said that if he still really wanted to help him, he should prepare for their safety. And after saying those words, she handed him a rope that was tight. They needed to tie the boy up so that he wouldn't run away and attack them when he turned into a monster. So Lee Ojin and the student went to fulfill it. They also took an elastic band to tie his hands. The girl also wiped all of his wounds that had blood on them, to make him look a bit like before. And before long the guy was completely tied up. They also duct-taped his mouth shut. Lee Ojin, when everything was ready, turned to the girl, saying that it was time for them to go as well. They grabbed their bags, which they had stuffed with food and water beforehand, and headed toward the exit to return to the motel. As soon as they stepped outside, Sul B felt a few drops fall on her skin. When she looked up, she saw that it was starting to rain. Soon it intensified, and they didn't even have time to go outside. The guy and the girl stood at the entrance to the store in complete shock, because all the monsters that were outside at that moment and felt the rain on their skin became stronger. They really liked the water. All the monsters opened their horrible mouths to fill them with water and gain energy for more attacks. At that moment, a strong female scream was heard throughout the street. It was Huang Ga-ai, who was running away from the monster that had attacked her classmate. Lee Ojin, who was watching all of this, was very surprised. He noticed that the monsters became much faster than they were before when the water hit them. He watched them enjoy the rain and realized that it was probably because of him. The guy didn't waste much time. He turned to the student and shouted for her to quickly go to the truck. But then suddenly, as they were about to go to the car, he suddenly stopped and stared fearfully at the transportation. Lee Ojin was scared because he saw the car start to drive away. Whoever was driving the car was apparently not going to wait for his allies, but was simply saving his life. Lee Ojin, upon seeing this, was very surprised. He asked through his teeth, "Does she really know how to drive?" Of course, the student who was being chased by the monster was driving. She immediately started driving away because she was not going to stay with the monsters. And before long, some of the monsters that had been distracted by her switched to the guy and girl who were still standing at the entrance to the store. Sul B was very scared when she saw this. She turned around towards the store and told the gentleman to tell them to go back inside. When they ran into the store, she suggested that they lower the curtain on the door so the monsters would lose sight of them. In the meantime, they would find somewhere to hide. The second they ran in, they immediately locked the doors, started lowering the curtain. After that, the girl brought the civil servant some rope and they tied the handles of the door so the monster wouldn't immediately sneak in. Then the monster, which had already come to the door, started banging on it hard. The boy and the girl were frightened, but they realized that this time they were saved. If they were a little slow, they would definitely get caught. The monsters kept banging on the door, trying to get in. However, of course, they were not succeeding. After a while, the sounds subsided, and the guy and girl decided to look out the window to see what was going on. Once they looked out, they saw no one outside. It continued to rain heavily, but there were no monsters in sight. Well, as soon as they turned their heads to the side, they saw the monster girl eating the poor cat with greediness. Sul B was horrified when she saw this. Then she replied in a quiet voice that it was as if they were in some kind of horror movie. Closing back the curtain, she also said that usually in zombie movies there are several kinds. Apparently in their case, Some are fast-moving and others are slow. Lee Ojin was very surprised when he heard this and asked how she determined it so quickly. The girl smiled and said that her dad actually liked zombie movies a lot. She then suggested that perhaps he was also in a similar situation at this point. Lee Ojin was silent for a while. After that, he said that it was actually hard to know for sure. But in any case, the situation on the mainland should be better than theirs. The girl was quite distressed. She sighed heavily and, holding back her tears, said that she hoped very much that it was so, and that her father was safe now. But at that moment their dramatic conversation was interrupted by a heavy knock on the door. But it was not coming from the street, but from inside the store. The boy and the girl were very frightened. Then they decided to see where the sounds were coming from. When they got to the door, the civil servant looked through the small window on the door, and on the other side of Lee, Ojin saw the poor guy they had tied up. He had already turned into one of the monsters. Sea vermin had grown on him, and the whole room stank horribly. When the civil servant stepped away from the door, the girl also looked. She was horrified by what she saw. Then she said that she knew Huang Ga-ai would do something like that one day. The guy was surprised and asked how she could be so sure. Sulbi sighed heavily after that and said that once her boyfriend couldn't pass the extra class selection, so the girl tried to force her to give up her elective seat. So for her boyfriend's sake, she was willing to do anything, even cheat, and the girl wouldn't be surprised if she set him up. They were silent for a while, but then Sulbi said that they weren't likely to get out of this place now anyway, so she suggested they get something to eat first. The civil servant agreed with her, and afterward reached into his bag to see what was left in it. The girl also started looking for something in the bag and said that luckily they hadn't loaded everything into the truck. Lee Ojin agreed with her and said that it was really good that they had kept at least something. The girl smiled and said that in the beginning she thought it was stupid to do that, but in the end, it even saved them. Lee Ojin looked at her in surprise and asked why she thought that. In fact, he felt embarrassed that they were alone together. Sulbi replied that they had left the food just in case. It was just that she wondered if they might need to stay in this place. The guy smiled and asked, "Did she even prepare for something like this?" The girl replied that of course she did because she thinks a lot ahead. Then he said, "Since that's the case," and she says, "Why did she give him ramen and a bottle of water before he left?" Sulbi smiled and gave him something from her bag, saying that it was all so that he would be more lenient if they ran into each other again. The girl laughed awkwardly, and the civil servant replied that it was quite resourceful at such a young age. He pulled out his bag and said it was getting colder, so he offered to take the baby warmers. They would sit on them and cover themselves with plaid, for that should warm them up a little. When Sulbi heard this, she agreed and thought it was a really good idea. And when she went to get her heating pads, when she came back, she saw that the civil servant was already sitting in the plaid. They said nothing to each other. She felt a little uncomfortable, but she also covered herself with the plaid and sat on the baby warmer next to him. Lee Ojin at this moment started to open the package with his food, and he wondered if there would be any boats at the marina so they could leave this place. But first, they should probably go back to the motel. He doesn't think that's the best idea, of course, but he has no choice. As the guy started eating his food, Sulbi suddenly turned to him. She looked him straight in the eye and asked if she could find out how old he was. Lee Ojin replied that he was now 31. The girl immediately remembered that he had said that earlier. Then she said that since she was younger, she could be like a sister to him. Sulbi was a little embarrassed and asked if she could call him brother instead of sir. The guy smiled but told her to just carry on as before. He was a stranger to her after all. Sulbi objected and said that he shouldn't be so polite. Who knows what will happen next? But at that moment their conversation was interrupted by a great noise coming from the warehouse. The girl was very frightened because the noise was indeed very loud. Lee Ojin quietly remained his seat and gestured for the girl to remain seated. Then he went to the door of the warehouse and looked through the window. When he looked inside, he was horrified, because that guy, despite being tied up, got up and started walking toward the door, all the while growling and saying his body itched terribly. Lee Ojin was terrified. However, he realized that they needed to act, as he might soon come to the door. So he called out to the girl and together they pushed the freezer box toward the exit, blocking the door. The boy was very frightened, but then he asked if they were sure they had tied him up well, and if so, how he was able to get free. At this point, the monster was already so close to the door that he could be seen through the window. He had been saying all along that his body was itching. He also said that he was hungry and very, very cold. Lee Ojin, watching this, didn't understand what was happening and how they should act. Seul B walked up to him at this moment and said that there couldn't be a mistake after all. Her classmates were treated exactly the same way. The guy turned to her and asked if she had already realized what stages the infection had. Of course, the girl understood all this. She said that at first they all complain about being cold, or on the contrary, very hot. After this, the Tinea parasites grow out of the soft parts of the body, and the vision gradually becomes blurred. After this stage, symptoms appear that are very similar to rabies. Seul B said that besides that, their appearance starts to change, and what happens next, she doesn't know. Lee Ojin was amazed that the girl knew all this. Then he asked her what she would say about the symptoms of Won Bin, who was now lying sick in the motel. The girl thought about it and said that the symptoms were actually the same as those of an infected person. However, he had not been bitten or injured, so a cold is also a possibility. The monster was looking out the window at this point and hissed for them to calm down instead of running. Hearing this, Lee Ojin walked closer to the window and said that they must really have very poor eyesight, but he still decided to check it out. At this point, he moved a little farther away, and then he began to move his palm closer to the glass. When it was very close, the monster reacted and started banging its head against it. Lee Ojin took his hand away and said that he couldn't say that the monster was completely blind. Seul B ignored his words and asked the gentleman how he was able to escape. The guy said he did it by using strong odors. He overpowered his scent with a liquid made from sea roaches. Now he's sure it's much more effective than body lotions, although the smell isn't pleasant. But at that moment, they heard the knocking again. Now it was coming from the street, and other monsters were knocking on their windows. Seul B heard this and decided to come closer. She said that the person knocking on the door looked like a show-off from the hotel. Lee Ojin was very surprised when he heard this and asked what the other nicknames were. The girl said that even on such a small island, he had to wave his luxury car keys everywhere. They opened the curtains, and she pointed to another monster, saying that the one on the far left was the pretender, with Afera next to her and Hannah near her. Lee Ojin, upon hearing this, wondered why only one parasite had a human name. The girl looked at him and smiled and said that was her real name, since she was a classmate of hers. After that, she turned around and tried to hold back her emotions so as not to cry. The guy didn't answer anything. He was saddened by this information. After saying that, he turned around and realized that it shouldn't go on like this. Lee Ojin walked to the cash register and took a cloth, then poured some sweet liquid on it. When he returned, he taped this cloth to the window so he could close it and not see the monsters. Lee Ojin told the girl not to blame herself, but rather let them think of a way to get out of this place without being seen. Seul B was very sad. However, she didn't answer anything to that. At this moment, the guy thought about what could be done to comfort her even a little. But then suddenly the girl turned to the gentleman, her voice very excited. She looked at the floor and asked if he had spilled his water. The civil servant, when he saw this, was very surprised. There was indeed a lot of water spilled on the floor. He asked why he was even doing that. Of course, he didn't. But then he realized what had happened. Lee Ojin went to another window and opened the curtain to see that the rain had gotten much heavier. There, of course, was a monster standing there. But when he looked a little further, he saw that the water was beginning to rise, and he realized that it was just that. A flood. Lee Ojin turned to the girl and said, "In fact, the idea of the doors will not be able to withstand this kind of pressure. They need to do something." Seul B was surprised and asked what they should do since they can't get out of the store now. The boy looked around the store and suggested that they start by putting all the groceries together, because he had an idea. The monsters at this point kept knocking on their windows. Soon, the guy and the girl put all the food together and rewrapped it with special tape so it would hold on and not float away anywhere. In fact, you can find life jackets almost everywhere on the island. So after a short search, they found them and put them on, then climbed onto the food they had put together. The water had already started to rise higher and higher. It had already reached the top shelves. Sul B remembered her survival class and lit a candle in an iron jar to light up the room. She was surprised and said that the water was actually rising much faster than expected. The civil servant tried to reassure her and said that it was tolerable for the time being. Then he turned and looked straight into her eyes and asked if she was still warm. Sul B nodded in agreement. However, she added that she thought she wouldn't stay like this for long. Leojin said that in that case, she should take a new one from her backpack, used now, because the most important thing was to keep warm. But the girl smiled and said there was nothing wrong with that. Besides, there's not many of them at all, so it's better to save money. At that moment, the man took out a heating pad, which was still intact. Sul B, seeing this, smiled and said that he could take the unopened one for himself. But the man at that moment put a heating pad in her hands and told her not to worry about him. Sul B looked at him in surprise, holding the heating pad in her hands. Then he asked, "Could there be something wrong? Why is she looking at him like that?" The girl replied that it's nothing like that. She just thinks he's incredible. Probably it's because of being in the sea for a long time. Leojin felt uncomfortable at these words. However, he said that no matter how it was compared to those who had been in this place for a long time, he was just a newcomer. Then she asked why the gentleman had suddenly decided to work on the island. The man hesitated and then said that it was probably because he was a responsible civil servant, or rather a lighthouse keeper. Sul B continued to ask around and wondered if he had planned to do something like this from the beginning. Leojin replied that not really. It just sort of came about on its own. He liked the sea, of course, and that's no denying. But he failed the civil service exams 5 times, then changed direction and applied to the local township. The tests there were not easy either. However, it was only because of his brother's support that things worked out for him, and he went through and got the job. Leojin looked away from the girl and said that he was far more important to him than any other person in this world. He wasn't sure if he could find the words to express his gratitude to his brother. The girl was very surprised and asked, "Does he really love him even more than his parents?" The boy was silent for a while. After that, he said that he met his older brother in the orphanage. Sul B regretted asking. She suddenly turned away and apologized for her questions, because she said it without thinking. The guy smiled and said that it was actually okay and there was nothing wrong with it. It's just that every person has a story, and even if it happened to him like that, it was much better than having no parents. But the girl objected and said that she was trying to comfort him. They were silent for a while. At that moment, Sul B clutched her heating pad in her hands tighter and said that she had mentioned earlier that her father liked to watch zombie movies and such. She thought that the gentleman must have been sad, so she decided to keep the conversation going. Leojin smiled and said that she didn't have to worry and that she could keep asking if she wanted to. She immediately became excited and asked, "Did he live in the Fupin neighborhood?" The girl liked the fact that she could at least distract herself with such conversations. Leojin said he was near Fupin Station on the first line. His brother lives there with his children, so when he leaves the island, he will go there right away. Sul B said that she actually lives in the Lulian neighborhood. The guy replied that he had been there once when he was studying for an exam. The girl, hearing this, became excited and asked, "Where did he live? Wasn't it in the college campus?" Leojin said that there was an alley opposite the big fish market, and if you went inside, but then he remembered that it seemed to have been demolished already. Sul B replied that her dad was even glad, because the price of housing had gone up because of the demolition, and now she was a little worried about him. The guy looked at her and smiled and said that if they did manage to escape the island, have her hurry home. Of course, that would be great. Just to get away for starters. The girl said that there is no network coverage at this location, with no rescue team on the entire island having arrived so far, and suggested maybe even the whole country is in this chaos at the moment. Leojin said it might be like that. He used to see disaster warning messages on his phone. But then suddenly, they heard heavy knocks on the window again. It was the monsters, and the water began to rise even more. They suddenly got worried. But then the boy said that perhaps they should leave the store at sunrise tomorrow. The girl supported him in this idea. But at that moment, suddenly a huge wave rushed into their store, seeping even through the iron roller shutters. The glass was flying in different directions. It could not withstand the water. The entire store quickly began to flood with water due to all the glass in the store being punctured. The boy and the girl were horrified when they saw this. They did not expect that it would happen so quickly, and, in fact, that they would at least manage to spend the night in this place. However, things didn't work out the way they thought they would. The water was so strong that soon the little island of food they had made themselves was also flooded. The boy and the girl found themselves underwater. Lee Ojin, who had his back nailed to the counter, realized that they had to get out immediately or they would be so flooded they would simply suffocate. He managed to grab hold of one of the doors and told the girl that they needed to get outside before the next wave arrived. Sul-bi turned to the master at this moment. She tried to swim closer to him to keep close, but then suddenly, the hoarse voice of the guy who was locked in the storeroom was heard behind her. He was asking them not to leave. The civil servant, when he saw this, did not understand how it happened, for he had tied the rope quite tightly. At this point, the monster had already run up to them. He swung at the guy to infect him with his virus while saying that they would all be together. The girl had already swam up to the guy at this moment, and Lee Ojin was able to react in time. He grabbed the net that was nearby and warded off the monster from them. The monster couldn't hit him. Then the guy said his fingers should be bandaged with duct tape, but they were completely empty. Then, Lee Ojin took a closer look at his hands and saw that sea parasites had grown instead of the thumbs that were there before. He must have torn them off in an attempt to free himself. The boy, seeing this, was frightened. He realized that this could not be tolerated any longer, and he hit the net so hard that the monster flew back a few meters. Seeing the monster trying to get out of the water, Lee Ojin realized that apparently the ropes on his legs hadn't come undone because the monster was really bad at it. But then he suddenly saw a rope floating past him. The guy reacted in time and immediately grabbed it, saying that he would probably attack right away. At this moment, the monster had already made its way to the surface and was swimming straight towards the guy. Lee Ojin realized that even a small scratch would be fatal to him. He took the rope and made for a space to appear, and in case of anything, to blot it out. He had to proceed very carefully, however. The girl at this point continued to hold the net just in case. However, at that moment all their plans were ruined because another wave came at them again. The boy realized that it was the water arriving again. Lee Ojin realized that if they were carried into the sea, they would simply drown, and there was no way to help them. Sul-bi, watching all this, saw that the guy was being carried straight to the exit. She shoved the net, which came right up to the door and blocked the way. At that point, the guy hit the net straight on. However, he didn't swim any further. He was already prepared for his fate. However, when he remained standing there, he exhaled happily and said that he had almost died. Sul-bi ran to him and asked if he was okay. When Lee Ojin saw the girl, he got excited and said that of course he was fine, but only because of her. Then he remembered the danger and asked where the guy who was the monster was. But the girl didn't seem to hear him and suggested that they should leave soon because one more wave might be their last. But the moment they had already sailed away from the entrance, a monster appeared behind them. He swung at the girl who was closest to him. He grabbed his dirty, bloody hand straight into the girl's bag. She was very frightened and screamed. She was lucky, however, because it wasn't her he grabbed. Sul-bi immediately let go of the bag because he was pulling it harder and harder. At that moment, the civil servant grabbed the net and started to get closer to him. He turned to the girl and told her to put her head down behind him. He had a rack in his hand, and he swapped the quick netting for something sturdier. At this moment, Lee Ojin, seeing that the girl had ducked down, hit the monster directly with this iron rack in the face. A few sea parasites even popped out of its mouth. Then he grabbed a stick and pierced the monster's body. The monster could no longer move and swam away with the current. Sulbi was very scared. She turned away so she wouldn't see the horror of it all and was shaking. Leojin watched the monster carefully. Then he saw that despite the iron rack leg at his head, he still opened his eyes and looked at him. Apparently, it was about to attack again. The guy turned to the student and said that they needed to leave now. Sulbi was still scared, but she knew she had to obey him. Soon they were able to get to their feet. Broken pipes and planks floated on the water next to them, and there was a lot of glass. Turned to the girl and said that apparently the water level had gone down. They thought that apparently it had gradually started to recede to other places. The girl went forward. She was about to go out when she suddenly noticed that the civil servant was not walking beside her. She turned around to see where he was, and then asked what he was doing, because Leojin had stopped next to the racks. The boy told her to wait a little while because he had to find the rope. The girl suddenly said in a frightened voice that he should not look for her. Leojin was very surprised. Then he turned around and was about to ask what was wrong, but he saw something that startled her. When he turned to the side, he saw a huge wave coming right at their store. The remaining shards of glass flew straight into the monster, which was also thrown into the store by the wave, coming at a very high speed. Leojin, who was being covered head to toe with water, shouted out to the girl to be careful and move closer to the wall because otherwise they would be thrown all over the store. Soon the glass that was next to the boy began to crack. It could no longer withstand the pressure from the water. After a while it did break and the guy and the girl were thrown out into the street. Leojin grabbed his bag he found in the water and stood up and said that the wave could sink them. Therefore, they should leave immediately. But when the girl didn't answer him, he panicked. The boy turned to her and asked if she could hear him. But when he turned around, he didn't see her. When he looked into the store, he saw that a rack had fallen down and some fabric was hanging on top of it.